In June of 2024, a man sat in a sterile side room at Dallas Airport, entirely unaware that the plastic bottle of water in his hand was about to destroy his life. He took a few sips, tossed the empty bottle into a trash can, and walked out to catch his flight. He thought it was just a routine customs check. But the moment the door clicked shut, detectives swooped in and pulled that bottle out of the garbage. They weren't looking for contraband. They were hunting for a microscopic trace of a monster who had evaded justice for 23 years. And the craziest part? The man who drank that water wasn't a shadowy stranger. He was someone the victim's family had once loved, trusted, and welcomed into their home. Welcome back to Retrograde Crime, your home for the cases that time forgot, and the twists you won't see coming. If you're new here, pull up a chair, hit that subscribe button, and join the gang. Today, we are diving into a cold case that baffled Maryland investigators for over 2 decades. It's a story of a brutal betrayal, a family left to pick up the pieces while living under a cloud of false suspicion, and the incredible genetic breakthrough that finally dragged a wolf out of sheep's clothing. Grab your coffee, settle in, and let's get into the tragic, twisted case of Leslie Prier.
911, what's your emergency?
I work for a company and we didn't have a call from an employee. We just walked in the door, our husband and I, and there's blood in the foyer, and looks like something possibly happened.
Are you with the husband?
I'm with the husband, yes.
Chevy Chase, Maryland is the kind of neighborhood where people pay a premium for peace of mind. It sits just north of the Washington, D.C. line. In the spring of 2001, it was quiet, wealthy, and incredibly safe. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and houses that looked like they belonged on postcards. It was the last place on earth you would expect to find a nightmare. And at the heart of this neighborhood was 48-year-old Leslie Prier. Leslie was a fixture in Chevy Chase. She was married to her husband Carl, who everyone in town called Sandy, and she was a devoted mom to her 24-year-old daughter, Lauren. To support her family, Leslie worked at an advertising production company in the city. If you asked anyone who knew her to describe Leslie, they'd tell you the exact same things, over and over again. She was warm, she was generous, but above all else, Leslie was incredibly reliable. She was a person of her word. If Leslie said she was going to be somewhere, she was there. No excuses. If some rare emergency did come up, she'd always call ahead to let you know. Which is why, on the morning of May 2, 2001, the silence from her end was so incredibly loud. 10 o'clock came and went at the advertising office. Leslie's desk was completely empty. Her phone just kept ringing and ringing, eventually dropping to voicemail. Her boss, Brett Reedy, knew instantly that something was wrong. This wasn't like Leslie. It wasn't even close. Brett started making calls, his worry growing with every busy signal. First, he reached out to her daughter, Lauren. Then, he called Leslie's husband, Sandy. Sandy was just as confused. He told Brett that he had last seen his wife about 2 hours earlier, around 7:45 a.m., right before he left for work. She'd been up, getting ready for her day, completely normal. Nothing seemed off. But now, it was nearly mid-morning, and no one could reach her. Unease quickly turning into flat-out panic, the two men agreed to meet up at the family home on Drummond Avenue to check on her. When they pulled up to the beautiful house, everything looked normal from the street. But the moment they unlocked the front door, the illusion of safety shattered. What they found stopped them cold right at the entrance. There was blood on the wall near the foyer. A dark puddle of it stained the hardwood floor. A small decorative table had been violently knocked over, its contents scattered. And then there was the heavy rug that normally sat right inside the front door. It had been dragged all the way into the living room, completely soaked through with blood. Sandy immediately started running through the house, screaming Leslie's name into the empty rooms. Nothing, just silence. He ran outside, frantically scanning the yard, asking neighbors if they'd seen his wife. He began calling local hospitals, his mind desperately clinging to any scenario that didn't end in tragedy. Maybe she fell, he thought. Maybe she got hurt, and a good Samaritan took her to the emergency room. But as Sandy searched, Brett was looking closer at the house. He walked down toward the basement, and that's when he heard a faint scratching. Behind a closed door, shut tight, was the family dog. It was locked in. It was a door the dog could never have closed on its own. Someone had intentionally put the dog down there and shut the door to keep it out of the way. Realizing they were standing in a major crime scene, Brett called 911. The dispatcher told both men to step outside immediately and wait for the police to arrive.
Can I ask you guys to step out of the house?
Sure.
Okay. sent the call, and police should gain right.
When the first officers pulled up, they saw Sandy pacing the driveway, frantic. They asked him if he had searched the entire house. Sandy looked down, the fear visible in his eyes. He admitted he had checked everywhere. Well, almost everywhere. He hadn't been able to bring himself to look inside the master bathroom. Officers went inside, leaving the two men on the lawn. They walked up the stairs, the air in the house heavy and still. As they reached the second floor, they started to hear a faint, steady sound, the sound of running water. They followed the noise directly into the master bathroom. The shower steam was thick. Inside the stall, the water was still running, pouring down over the quiet figure of Leslie Prier. She was gone. As investigators processed the scene over the next several hours, a chilling picture began to form. This wasn't a robbery that got out of hand. It was far more deliberate. Leslie had been ambushed right by her front door. She had fought for her life, struggling hard enough to leave her own marks on her attacker. But she had been overpowered, and afterward, the killer had carried her body all the way upstairs, placed her in the shower, and turned on the faucet, a cold, calculated attempt to wash away the evidence of what they had done. As the sun began to set over Drummond Avenue, detectives were left with a haunting question. Who had a key to this house, a reason to hurt Leslie, and the intimate knowledge to hide her body in a bathroom most guests would never even know existed? In almost every single homicide investigation, detectives start their search in the exact same place, the spouse. It is not an accusation, and it is not because the police are lazy. It is simply where the cold, hard facts of human nature usually point. And Carl Sandy Prier knew that just as well as anyone. From the very beginning, Sandy did not run from the spotlight. He sat down with investigators, answered their questions, and tried to help. But the closer the detectives looked at Sandy, the worse things started to look for him. By Sandy's own admission, his marriage to Leslie had been under a massive amount of strain. In the months leading up to her death, Leslie had been struggling heavily with alcohol. Sandy was brutally honest with the police. He told them that Leslie was, in his exact words, an absolute love and a beauty when she wasn't drinking. But when she did drink, it was a lot. He admitted to detectives that it was getting incredibly hard to deal with, and that he'd sometimes stay out late just to avoid the tension waiting for him at home. Right away, detectives had a motive. Then came the timeline. Investigators asked Sandy to walk them through his movements on the evening of May 1st, the night before Leslie was found. Sandy laid out a highly detailed step-by-step account. He went to the dump. He visited 3 different retail stores, searching for a very specific battery charger. He finally got home around 9 p.m., but to the experienced detectives sitting across from him, this didn't sound like a natural human memory. It sounded rehearsed. It sounded like a man building himself an alibi, one deliberate block at a time. To make matters worse, a neighbor came forward with a strange detail. They told police that on the night before Leslie was found, every single light in the Prier home was turned on, but the curtains were drawn tightly shut. The neighbor noted that this was highly unusual for that house. It felt like someone was trying to hide what was happening inside. With the pressure mounting, Sandy agreed to take a polygraph test. He failed it. For the investigators in 2001, that failed lie detector test was the ultimate confirmation. A strained marriage, a hyper-detailed errand run, a suspicious house with drawn curtains, and a failed polygraph. They brought Sandy in for formal questioning the very day Leslie's body was found. But Sandy quickly realized the walls were closing in. After 2 hours of intense grilling, he asked for a lawyer, and the interview ended. A few weeks later, Sandy came back to the station on his own. Detectives tried to play hardball. They told him they had physical evidence, and that physical evidence does not lie. They claimed Leslie was dead before 7 a.m., and they told him they had proof she never actually called him from the house that morning, despite what he had claimed. Sandy just sat there, listened, and stayed calm. He told them plainly that he had been cooperating since day one. He had answered enough questions. His attorney had told him to stop talking, and he was going to follow that advice. Then, he looked the detective in the eye and asked a simple question. Am I free to leave? The detective had to say yes. Sandy stood up, turned around, and walked out. No hesitation. But while Sandy was legally free, he was far from actually free. In a wealthy, tight-knit community like Chevy Chase, secrets are currency, and gossip spreads like wildfire. Word quickly got out that Sandy was the prime suspect. Neighbors who used to wave now looked away when he drove by. Whispers followed him down the supermarket aisles. A heavy, dark cloud of quiet suspicion settled over his life, and it did not lift. For 2 agonizing months, Sandy lived as a social pariah, raising his daughter Lauren while grieving the brutal loss of his wife, under the watchful, judging eyes of the entire town. Then, the crime lab finished its work. Scientists had been painstakingly analyzing the scrapings taken from underneath Leslie Prier's fingernails. They knew that during that desperate, violent struggle near the front door, Leslie had clawed at her attacker. She had trapped his identity right under her nails. The lab successfully extracted a clean profile of male DNA. They ran it against Sandy's. It wasn't a match. It wasn't even close. The DNA under Leslie's fingernails belonged to another man entirely. Sandy Prier was officially, mathematically cleared of his wife's murder. But while the science cleared his name on paper, it could never erase the damage that had been done. The community's suspicion had left deep, permanent scars. Sandy stayed in Chevy Chase. He raised Lauren, and he grieved Leslie in the very same house where she was taken from him. Once the DNA cleared Sandy Prier, the investigators in Montgomery County had to throw out their entire playbook. They had spent months convinced the husband did it. Now, they were back to square one, but with a major twist. They had a pristine genetic profile of the killer. They just didn't have a name to go with it. So, they started casting an incredibly wide net. Detectives knocked on doors throughout the Chevy Chase community. They went to Leslie's workplace. They gathered a list of every single man who had a documented connection to Leslie Prier. Co-workers, friends, casual acquaintances, even neighbors. One by one, detectives asked these men for a DNA sample, and one by one, those men complied. But as the lab ran the tests, the results kept coming back the same. No match. No match. No match. Now, before we find out what happened to this DNA profile, I have to ask you a serious question. We are deep into this tragic mystery, and if you are sitting there listening to this story without being subscribed to the channel, what are you doing? Every week, we piece together these incredibly complex cases for the Retro Gang, and honestly, seeing that 70% of you still haven't subscribed breaks my heart just a little bit. Don't leave the channel in suspense like this case. Hit that subscribe button right now, join the gang, and make sure you never miss a twist. With local leads drying up, investigators pinned their hopes on the National Criminal Database. In September of 2001, they officially uploaded the unknown male DNA profile into the system. This database holds genetic records of convicted felons from all across the country. If the killer had ever been locked up for a serious crime, or if he ever committed one in the future, his name would flash on their screens. But when they hit search, nothing. Just silence. This meant something very specific and highly frustrating for the detectives. The monster who did this was a ghost to the system. He didn't have a criminal record. He wasn't a known offender. He was someone living a completely ordinary, law-abiding life on the surface. And while the police hit a wall, Leslie's 24-year-old daughter, Lauren, was left trapped in a living nightmare. Imagine being 24 and trying to process the fact that your mother was brutally taken from you, right inside your own home. Lauren found herself caught between two completely conflicting thoughts that refused to let her sleep. On one hand, she couldn't fully clear her father, Sandy, in her own mind. Even after the DNA test came back negative, she knew how statistics worked. She knew the spouse is almost always the one. But on the other hand, she knew her father. She had watched him her entire life. This was a man who cried easily. This was a man who buried the family's pet hamsters in the backyard and made tiny, neat graves for them. He had never raised a hand to her, or to her mother, even when Leslie was struggling at her worst. Lauren simply could not reconcile the gentle man she knew with a brutal killer. But if it wasn't her father, then who was it? Lauren told detectives something that would turn out to be incredibly prophetic. She said she believed, deep down, that it had to be someone her mother knew. Someone who was comfortable in their home. The master bathroom on Drummond Avenue wasn't in an obvious spot. It wasn't a place a random intruder, panicking after a struggle, would easily find to hide a body. It took intimate knowledge of that house to walk up those stairs, go directly to that specific bathroom, and turn on that shower. Lauren told police that even if it turned out to be a friend, or even a friend's boyfriend, she would never call that person innocent just because she knew them. If they did it, they were a monster. But with no matches, no suspects, and no new leads, the files were tucked away. Months turned into years. Years turned into decades. The physical evidence sat in cardboard boxes inside a dark storage room. Sandy Prier grew older under the quiet, lingering suspicion of his neighbors, eventually passing away in 2017 without ever getting his name truly cleared in the court of public opinion. But buried deep within those dusty files, on a single sheet of paper, was a tip. It had been called in by a neighbor just months after the murder. It was a single name. At the time, in 2001, that name meant absolutely nothing to investigators. They didn't have the tools to connect it to the crime, so it was filed away and forgotten. It would sit there, completely undisturbed, for over 20 years. By the year 2022, the murder of Leslie Prier was more than just a cold case. It was a ghost story. The original detectives had retired. The neighborhood had moved on. But at the Montgomery County Police Department, a brand new cold case unit was about to breathe fresh life into the investigation. Detectives Tara Augustin and Allison DuPuy were paired together, and they pulled the dusty Prier file out of storage. To these detectives, a cold case wasn't a dead end. It was unfinished business. They decided to treat this 21-year-old murder exactly as if the call had come in that very morning. They looked at what they had. They had a perfect genetic profile of the killer. But they also had a major problem. The National Criminal Database had yielded nothing for over 2 decades. To break the stalemate, detectives Augustin and DuPuy turned to a revolutionary tool that simply did not exist back in 2001: Forensic Genetic Genealogy. The concept is incredibly simple, yet deeply powerful. Instead of running the killer's DNA through a closed database of known criminals, they sent the profile to a specialized lab. The lab uploaded the genetic blueprint to open, public genealogy databases. These are the exact same services that everyday people use to trace their family trees, find distant relatives, or discover their ancestry. The database doesn't need a direct match to the killer. It just needs to find someone who shares even a tiny percentage of DNA with him. If a user in that database shares a small amount of DNA with the unknown sample, it means they share a common ancestor. Sometimes, the search results come back with thousands of names, most of them incredibly distant. It is a massive, complicated jigsaw puzzle. For a year and a half, detectives Augustin and DuPuy meticulously worked through these matches. They built out family trees branch by branch, generation by generation, trying to find a path that led back to Chevy Chase, Maryland. Most of the leads went absolutely nowhere. But then, one match stood completely apart from the rest. It was a genetic trail that led directly to a family line in Romania. Detective Augustin began digging intensely through public records tied to this Romanian family. She needed to understand how a genetic line from Eastern Europe could possibly connect to a quiet suburb just north of Washington, D.C. She traced the names, tracking births, marriages, and immigration records. And then, as she was scrolling through the family tree she had built, a specific surname flashed on her screen: Gligor. The name stopped her dead in her tracks. She had seen that name before. Detective Augustin went back to the original dusty paper files from 2001. She flipped through the old yellowed reports, searching through lists of friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. And there, buried in the case file, she found it. Eugene Gligor. Years earlier, investigators had briefly spoken with Eugene because of his connection to Leslie's daughter, Lauren. Eugene and Lauren had met at Bethesda Chevy Chase High School. They had dated for 5 years, eventually breaking up about 2 years before the murder. Detectives Augustin and DuPuy sat in their office, mapping out the family tree with this new, shocking piece of information. The genetics didn't lie. Eugene Gligor was a distant relative of the person whose DNA had originally flagged the Romanian family line. He was the perfect genetic fit, and suddenly, the terrifying puzzle pieces of this case began to fall into place. Lauren's theory from 20 years prior had been completely correct. The killer wasn't a random intruder. It was someone who knew the house. During the 5 years Eugene dated Lauren, he had been a constant presence on Drummond Avenue. He had been welcomed at family dinners, celebrated holidays with them, and spent countless afternoons in that house. Leslie Prier had always liked him. She thought he was a polite, sweet kid. But while Leslie and Lauren trusted him, Sandy Prier had always been more cautious. He had told Lauren more than once that something about Eugene felt slightly off, even though he could never put his finger on exactly what it was. As the detectives dug deeper into Eugene's background, they realized Sandy's intuition had been tragically accurate. Eugene Gligor had a history of rough edges. His parents had divorced while he was dating Lauren, and he had handled it incredibly poorly. He had been expelled from a boarding school. As a teenager, he had even been accused of assaulting a woman on a local bike path, though Lauren had defended him to the police at the time. Because none of those incidents had ever led to a felony conviction, Eugene's DNA had never been entered into a criminal database. He had slipped right through the cracks, living his life completely undetected. Detectives finally had their prime suspect, but they had to be incredibly careful. If they wanted to make an arrest, they couldn't rely on family trees and probability. They needed Eugene Gligor's actual, physical DNA, and they had to get it without him ever knowing they were looking. To catch a killer who has been hiding in plain sight for over 2 decades, you have to play a very delicate game. By 2024, detectives Augustin and DuPuy were absolutely convinced that Eugene Gligor was their man. The family tree they had built from the genetic databases pointed directly to him. But in the eyes of the law, a genealogical family tree is not enough to put handcuffs on someone. It is a guide, not absolute proof. To get an arrest warrant, they needed a direct, physical DNA sample from Eugene himself, and they had to get it without letting him know they were even looking at him. If Eugene got wind that the police were closing in, he could run. He could destroy evidence. The detectives had to move in total silence. As they planned their next move, they kept digging into Eugene's life, trying to understand who this man had become in the 23 years since Leslie's murder. On the surface, he had built a normal life. He got married, twice. He built a career. But behind closed doors, a much darker picture was beginning to emerge. Detectives uncovered a protective order petition filed in 2021 by Eugene's second wife during their separation. In those court documents, she described a man who was deeply unpredictable and prone to sudden, terrifying fits of rage. She wrote that he would throw objects, punch walls, and that she was constantly terrified in her own home. Though a judge ultimately denied the petition due to a lack of legal grounds under the specific statute, for the detectives, it was a massive red flag. The angry, explosive teenager who had dated Leslie Prier was still very much alive inside the adult Eugene Gligor. But there was another complication. The Gligor family tree didn't just point to Eugene. He had a brother named Andre. In the eyes of science, their DNA profiles would look incredibly similar. Until detectives could isolate Eugene's specific DNA, they couldn't legally rule his brother out. They needed a sample from Eugene, and Eugene alone. The breakthrough came in June of 2024, when detectives learned that Eugene was returning to the United States from an international trip. He was scheduled to land at Washington Dulles International Airport. This was their window. This was the moment to spring the trap. Detectives coordinated with Customs and Border Protection at Dulles Airport. They didn't want a loud, dramatic scene at the terminal. They wanted everything to look completely, boringly routine. When Eugene's flight touched down and he walked through customs, he was quietly flagged and pulled aside. He was told he needed to go into a secondary screening room. To Eugene, this probably felt like an annoying bureaucratic delay. He was traveling internationally, extra baggage checks and random questionings happen all the time. He was led into a quiet, sterile side room. He sat down at a table, and on that table, completely naturally, someone had placed a couple of standard, sealed plastic bottles of water. It was a hot summer day. Eugene had just offloaded a long flight. He was tired, his throat was dry, and there was a bottle of water sitting right in front of him. He reached out, cracked the seal, and took a drink. He sat there, answering routine questions, completely unaware that with every single sip, he was leaving his microscopic signature on the plastic mouthpiece of that bottle. He was handing over the one piece of evidence that would decide his fate. When the customs officers finished their routine questions, they told Eugene he was free to go. He stood up, grabbed his bags, and on his way out of the room, he picked up the empty water bottle and tossed it into the trash can. The moment the door closed behind him, detectives entered the room. They didn't touch anything with bare hands. They carefully retrieved the discarded water bottle from the garbage, secured it in an evidence bag, and rushed it directly to the crime lab. For 9 long days, detectives waited. They had waited 23 years for this moment, but those 9 days felt like an eternity. The lab technicians painstakingly extracted the DNA from the rim of the water bottle and ran it against the unknown male profile recovered from underneath Leslie Prier's fingernails, all the way back in 2001. On June 17, 2024, the results finally came back. It was a perfect, undeniable match. The DNA on that ordinary, discarded plastic water bottle belonged to the exact same man who had struggled with Leslie Prier in her foyer, who had carried her upstairs, and who had left her in that running shower. The ghost finally had a name. And 23 years after he walked out of the house on Drummond Avenue, the clock had finally run out for Eugene Gligor. On the morning of June 18, 2024, the sun was shining, and the temperature in Washington, D.C. was climbing into the low 80s. It felt like just another beautiful summer morning. Eugene Gligor was sitting quietly on the front steps of his apartment building. He had a warm cup of coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, just starting his day. He had absolutely no idea that his 23 years of freedom were about to end in a matter of seconds. Suddenly, a tactical task force of U.S. Marshals surrounded the steps. They ordered him to put his hands up. Eugene didn't fight. He didn't run. Within moments, the coffee cup was gone, and his wrists were locked in cold metal handcuffs. A few hours later, Eugene sat in a sterile interrogation room at the Montgomery County Police Department. Across the table sat detectives Augustin and DuPuy. At first, Eugene didn't seem to grasp why he was there. He chatted slowly, offering up random, unsolicited details about his life, his education, and his years of sobriety. Then, the detectives dropped the name, Leslie Prier. He didn't ask Leslie who. He didn't ask where she lived. He knew exactly who they were talking about. He admitted he used to spend time at the Prier home back in the 90s when he dated Lauren.
Okay.
I'm sure you're wondering what this is all about.
I would really like to know. This has been really hard, whatever's happening.
Well, we're going to get through all of that with you.
Do you recall back in 2001, Leslie Prier?
Yes, that she was murdered, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So that's the case that we are investigating. You went to BCC with her daughter at the time?
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay. And what was your relationship with Lauren, the daughter?
We had dated.
Okay. And when did you guys date? Do you remember years?
Exact dates, I'm not entirely sure.
Were you in high school or was it after high school?
Yeah, it was high school. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe like 1994 to 1997 or something around there.
Okay. And from your dates of birth, I can see you're a little bit younger than Lauren. So was she already graduated from high school, or were you guys both still in high school when you guys were dating?
We were both in high school. She had finished high school, and I believe we had dated for a few months while she was...
He spoke calmly, choosing his words with extreme care. But then, the detectives laid their cards on the table. They told him they had a DNA profile from the crime scene that had sat unidentified for over 2 decades. And then they told him about the water bottle from the airport. They told him his DNA was a perfect match. Eugene sat in silence for a moment. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He just flatly said he had no memory of it. He claimed the accusation wasn't fair and that he was being treated as guilty until proven innocent. When the detectives pushed him for an explanation as to why his biological blueprint was under Leslie's fingernails, Eugene offered a chilling, unprompted theory. He suggested that maybe it was an interrupted burglary. Shortly after, he asked for a lawyer, and the interview ended. One of the detectives made a quiet observation as they walked out. There wasn't a single tear on his face. For nearly a year, Eugene Gligor maintained his innocence, claiming his mind was a complete blank. But on May 7, 2025, inside a Montgomery County courtroom, he finally changed his story. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He still wouldn't give a full confession. Instead, he claimed he suffered from drug and alcohol-induced blackouts around the time of the murder. He said he only remembered stopping by the house around 9:30 a.m. that morning and getting into a physical altercation with Leslie. He said the rest was a blur. He apologized for not being able to give the family the answers they had waited 24 years to hear. The prosecutors weren't buying it. They called it a crime without a motive that the defendant simply refused to admit. At his sentencing on August 28, 2025, the courtroom was packed with over 60 people. 6 members of the Prier family stood up to speak, describing the agonizing 24-year toll of Leslie's absence. But the most heartbreaking moment came when Lauren Prier stood up to face her high school sweetheart, the boy she had once loved, the boy who had comforted her after her mother's death, the boy who had actually looked her in the eye years later at a chance encounter on the street and offered his condolences. She looked directly at Eugene and asked him why. She called him a monster. She called him a wolf in sheep's clothing. The trial revealed the devastating, invisible scars Lauren had carried for over 2 decades. For years after the murder, Lauren was so traumatized by how her mother was found that she could not shower alone. She had to buy completely clear shower curtains for her home, so she would never have to wonder what was hiding on the other side. And even now, 25 years later, whenever she is in an unfamiliar place, she still has to check behind every single shower curtain she sees. When it was his turn to speak, Eugene Gligor finally dropped the act. He told the court he felt deep regret, shame, and remorse. He said he was relieved. He said, "The secret is over." The judge called the attack an incredibly violent, deeply personal crime, noting that there had been blood everywhere. He sentenced Eugene Gligor to 22 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Today, Gligor is serving out that sentence in a Maryland prison. Sandy Prier never lived to see this day. He died 8 years before the truth came to light, carrying a heavy burden of public suspicion he never deserved. The tragedy of this case wasn't just the brutal loss of Leslie Prier. It was the 23 years of stolen peace, the false accusations, and the terrifying reality that the monster wasn't a stranger hiding in the dark. He was already inside the house. And that retro gang is the chilling, tragic case of Leslie Prier. It is a sobering reminder that sometimes, the people we let closest to us are the ones we should fear the most. If this deep dive kept you on the edge of your seat, please make sure to smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and tells the algorithm that the Retro Gang wants more deep, high-quality cases just like this one. If you haven't already, subscribe to Retrograde Crime and turn on those notifications so you never miss a video. Drop your thoughts in the comments below on these 3 questions. First, how do you feel about the sentence? Do you think 22 years is enough justice for a crime that stole 24 years of peace from a family, or did the system let Eugene Gligor off too easy? Second, what do you make of Gligor's blackout defense? Do you think he truly didn't remember the details of that morning, or was it just one final, cowardly way to avoid admitting the horrific details of what he did? And third, Sandy Prier spent the rest of his life under a shadow of doubt. How can communities do a better job of supporting people who are falsely accused, even after DNA completely clears their name? Let me know your thoughts down below. I'll be hanging out in the comments section reading what you have to say. Until next time, Retro Gang, keep your eyes open, stay safe, and I will see you in the next case.